come out on a Saturday morning. I know at our house, Saturday is usually a happy day that we don't have to set an alarm. And if you watched the World Series game last night, you would be happy not to have set the alarm after the 18th inning was finally over, right? But it's just great to set aside time where you can just focus in on training and learning. And last night we kind of set a basic foundation for disciple-making ministries. And hopefully that was an easy analogy that now that whole disciple-making theology is stuck in your mind. And somebody says disciple-making, and you think, no, I need to look in the lemon meringue pie section of Baker Book House. Okay? And I don't think they have one of those. But it's just that same basic idea. You can just see me with my cookbook looking at a picture. So you start with the end in mind. What's a disciple look like from John chapter 15? And then when I make my lemon meringue pie, I need my ingredients. Bill helped me with my oatmeal this morning, and he measured the water and took the cup and ran a knife across the top of it. So he's learning something, during this. It's amazing what people remember and all the stuff they forget, But that thing of getting those ingredients, which are going and baptizing and teaching. And then you get that third part where with that pie, then you had a process to follow. And Jesus maps out for us in his life and in his testimony that 4-step process. Because some people are at a level 1 where my friend and he said, moving the training up another notch. And the remain in me, I still like the way Bill Hall describes it. It was this massive change because Jesus was leaving them physically, leaving them the Holy Spirit, and leaving them, do you remember the third one? Years ago, I was teaching at a church in Wisconsin, and I landed at a regional airport. Now, of course, Grand Rapids is not really a regional airport, but I did fly into Muskegon once. That's kind of small, I remember how much I had to duck to get into the plane, and I think I backed in so I could fit into the seat, And there was just a curtain between us and the pilots in those days. But regional airports, we were about an hour and a half at least from where the church was. Now, I know here an hour and a half sounds like the other side of Grand Rapids at 5 in the afternoon, okay? But this was a real hour and a half drive. And we're going along and leaving the regional airport and heading to where I'm supposed to speak for about 3 or 4 days. And the pastor is a longtime friend of mine. And I said, I just read something that really rattled my brain. And it was about a church that was very intentional in their outreach. And they had the kind of resources that they could do some really significantly insightful diagnostics of their congregation. And after a survey that was done of this rather large church, listen to what they wrote. According to our survey, 40%, okay, you got that? 40% of the regular attendees in our adult worship environments described themselves as unchurched before they began attending our church. 40%. Now listen to what he said next. We define unchurched as not having attended a church for 5 years or longer. Now just kind of let that one sink in. Here's this congregation, approaching half of them said, before I came to this church, I hadn't attended church for 5 years. Now that significantly rattled my brain. I have pastoral ministry experience. God gave me the opportunity to be in southern Iowa in a little town of 1,700 where we didn't have a traffic light in the entire county. And really most of the people I knew out there are still exactly where they were when I left, and the town hasn't really grown. And when you looked at that church, it would not be 40% were previously unchurched. And God moved me to a church that was in a blue-collar kind of setting where I had iron workers, steel workers, tool and die workers, kind of that's dynamic in the church, growing population there, but we wouldn't have been anywhere near, even with the growth we saw during our time there, we wouldn't be anywhere near 40% previously unchurched. I pastored a church across from a Bible college and seminary. Well, we definitely were It was more like 40% are college educated, and many of them with doctorates and above, just like experience. And this was a highly, committed congregation. And we started raising the numbers of those that didn't have church background. And the last church I pastored was outside of Detroit, or as you might say here in Grand Rapids, Detroit. That happened to me going out of Paris, and they said, we can't print your boarding pass to Detroit. I said, I'm not going to Detroit, I'm going to Detroit. But anyway, we got home. But that one was an upper level, management kind of church. And these guys were in the automobile industry and the second tier and third tier industries and business owners. And we were nowhere near a statistic like that. And it just rattled my brain. So I shared with the pastor as he's driving, and he got really quiet. That's kind of not to be expected. You hear something like that, and you're just kind of like, as a pastor, you're going, And what's interesting is he thought about it, and he thought very carefully, and then he really rattled my brain. He said, well, at our church, it's probably 35%. It's like, really? Smaller community, middle part of Wisconsin, and he says, we've got probably 35%. And so now it's like, okay, I read it in a book, but now I've got a guy sitting next to me in the car, and he's talking about a number that's approaching that. He said, no, really, I really think it'd be about 35% of our congregation in my years that I've been there, that the growth we've experienced is coming from people that are in church. And I'm kind of like, how? How'd that happen? And his answer was very interesting. One aspect was the training he had done to the congregation regarding how to just be constantly raising the flag to their faith. And just in simple little ways, saying things that would identify themselves as followers of Jesus Christ. I tell the story about working in a Harley-Davidson dealership. And I was in an environment where, and I've thought about this, I don't know anybody else in the employment of that dealership that went to church regularly. So I was kind of like the only one. And there were times I'd be working with a customer, and I've told this story to some of you, where I'd finally look at them and I'd say something like, well, you don't know me very well. I said, but I'm a person of faith. And because of my faith, integrity is extremely important to me. And I'm going to tell you, that's as good as this offer is going to get. And by saying that, I mean there's not another dollar in this offer, because that's good as it's going to get. But how did I get to that point in my bartering? I said, I'm a person of faith. Integrity is important to me. When I was in sales, there were times that I'd be talking with somebody about an item that they wanted to buy, and I'd say, well, sales is my second career. That's a fun one. Then they go, oh, well, what was your first career? Now, all this emphasis on diversity today, right? What am I going to say? I said, oh, I was in the faith-based nonprofit world. And they said, what's that? Well, that's where your pay is so low you make no. So then I said, oh, I was a pastor or a mission board executive, whatever it was. I said, oh, really? But what have I done? I've just kind of raised the flag. And the main thing this pastor did to raise the flag is not only teach his congregation how to create those opportunities to let people know, hey, I'm a part of the group that's called a follower of Christ, and teach them how to share their faith, but the thing that he modeled for them is he liked to hunt. And so he joined a gun club. And he's out with these guys. He said, sometimes it's like, hey, we're going to go out and clean up the range. Now, it was a conservative kind of church, and I know a lot of opinions develop on these kind of things, and so I'll just tell you the story there is they'd clean up, and then somebody'd get out a cooler, and they'd pop the lid off the cooler and start throwing cans of beer at everybody, and then a Pepsi'd come flying his way. But he's just right there hanging out with the guys, and I know what it's like to get off work at a Harley-Davidson dealership, go to the porch, as we call it, everybody else is drinking, and I'm drinking too, because I had my favorite brand of iced tea in somebody's fridge, But just hanging out, being with the people, being real. And I have a wonderful story I enjoy telling about the day that I got into the middle of a group of pagans, and that is a motorcycle gang, and they're the hardcore guys. And I listened to him talk about that and think about here he's teaching his people how to raise the flag in nondescript, kind of non-confrontational ways that just open up the door for conversations about what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. And he is, as the pastor, getting outside the four religious walls where he's out there in the community. Guys doing what some guys like to do, go out and shoot guns and once they kill things. You know, I'm not a hunter, and I don't mind people that hunt. Actually, that was the church where they had me with the teens during Sunday school, and we threw it open for Q&A, and one kid raises his hand and says, "So what's your view of gun control?" And I said, "Don't point it at me. Control your gun." Okay, let's go to the next question. But it's that kind of environment, you just roll with it. But I think, too, about how without intentionality, God burdened my heart to get out of church. So Southern Iowa, I became a member of the volunteer ambulance squad and hung out at the hospital, became a baseball coach for the youngest age, where our shortest home run, the ball just got past the dirt in front of home plate. But thanks to overthrows, it was a home run. 2-3 foot home run. You've never seen one of those until that's when you've really lived a baseball life. And then in Ohio, I found an opportunity to go to the newspaper one day and say, "Hey, I see your religious writer quit. I'll be glad to write for you." And they said, "Well, let's try a couple." And then finally they said, "You've got it." And I could put 200 words a week in, unedited by them. Well, they did add a lot of spelling mistakes that my brother, the English professor, would get on me about. And I said, "I didn't do those mistakes." But I ended up with this visibility within the community that got me invited to things that were for community leaders. Speaking at Kiwanis, speaking at events at the school, being teacher of the day at the high school. That's a real trip sometimes, And in Michigan, the door opened to a baseball chapel, and I'd go to the stadium, and here's a door that said on it, "Absolutely no admittance." And I thought, why'd you put a door there? I'm a pretty simple-minded person, and the previous chaplain had told me this horror story about what had happened to him in the locker room. So every time I got there, I'd put my hand on that doorknob, and I would say, "Thank you, God, for opening this door to me, and God help me, what's going to happen next?" Open the door and walk in, and then it just was interesting to see how God would open doors like that. And when we talk about discipleship and evangelism, there's a lot of discipleship that needs to happen within the four religious walls. But we cannot view the church as a fortress. We need to view it as an outpost, and especially today. Now, there's a verse in Luke chapter 19 that John MacArthur describes as the single most important truth in the Bible. That's a pretty high comment by John MacArthur. And that verse says this: "The Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." You and I are to be a part of that mission. And our text today is one that's going to help us begin to learn how to join Jesus in his mission. And when you turn in your Bibles, please, to Luke chapter 19. It's in Luke chapter 19 that we find that verse that I've just read, that John MacArthur speaks so highly of, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." Now, yesterday I taught you a Bible principle about studying the Bible. Look for the words that are repeated. Another thing is context. And I say this sadly, context is a wonderful but often ignored thing. When we look at the Word of God, there's two ways to look at it. One is, what was the author's original intent? And the other is, what is the truth it rightly affirms? Now, I'm not going to embarrass you by asking for verbal response on this, but if I were to say to you, what's 1 Corinthians 13 about? My guess is many of you would say love. Yes, that passage teaches about love, but the original intent was Paul was dealing with spiritual gifts. Original intent, spiritual gifts, what's it teach about? It teaches about love. So context helps us understand that. I do a series of messages where I'm setting verses in the context of 1 Corinthians 8 through 10, and that's a pretty big chunk of context. And what's interesting with that verse, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost," the context is Zacchaeus. When we hear Zacchaeus, what do? Well, we break out into song. Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he. And away we go. Of course, that's not a praise song, so some of you might not know that one. Is that sarcasm? There are songs that were written before Hillsong was invented, you know? And so we'd sing this thing. And Zacchaeus is kind of interesting. Zacchaeus' name really means, it means righteous one, but it really should have been more like renegade. You know, he was a tax collector. Well, worse than that, he was a chief tax collector. You talk about pyramid schemes, that was a pretty good gig to get if you were into the money and not into the morality. And for a Jewish person to become a tax collector working with the Romans, and the tax collectors were known for their corruptness, and so you're talking about kickbacks and paybacks and everything else. I guess it maybe been a biblical example of colluding with the Romans, you know, kind of thing. And he's in the midst of all of that. And the story of Zacchaeus, so many times, you know, we just get caught in like minor details. He was a little guy. He was a short man, you know, and he climbed a tree. And we're more fascinated with the fact this short little man climbed a tree. But when we ought to get into the text and start to see what's going on here, because Jesus is showing how he did mission. And if we're going to join Jesus in his mission, this is one of those texts to teach us how to join him in his mission in his way. And the first is we need to be intentional. We need to be focused on making outsiders insiders. Let me read verses 1 through 5. Now, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. And there was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector, and surprise, 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 he was rich. I'm sorry, the surprise, 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 I know it's not in your English versions. It's in the original Greek, I'm pretty sure, okay? I just give you a little Greek extra there. But on account of it, out of the crowd, he could not see Jesus because he was of small stature. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was about to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry, come down, for I must stay at your house today. Well, pretty bold statement there. Now, in some cultures, hospitality is almost required. Somebody comes to your door and says, I need a place to stay. Hospitality is basically required. We're not so geared to that because we're North Americans. But this would not have been, you know, really that outlandish in some respects because they didn't have Motel 6 and Holiday Inn Express and all those things. But you notice the intentionality of it. Here comes Jesus. He looks up and he sees this shorter person in a tree, calls him out by name, and says, I must stay in your house today. You see, Zacchaeus would have been known. Zacchaeus would have been disliked. But Jesus wasn't there just for the adulation of the people that at that time were his temporary followers. But he focused on that one man that he knew needed his message that day. When we were in seminary, it was the seminary we attended, midway between Philadelphia and Allentown, Pennsylvania. We were in an area that was strongly Mennonite, a certain amount of kind of like Amish sort of brethren influence. A number of people spoke Pennsylvania Dutch. The only phrase I learned was Danke für Snicksters Havershund, which means thanks for the next time. I already got this one. It's like a great little phrase. Charlie taught us that. Charlie lived across the street from the seminary. He was in his early 80s, and he was a Pennsylvania Dutch huckster. Charlie would buy anything he could sell for $1 more. Mostly he sold pigeons. Yeah, to pigeon shoots, and I know those have been socially condemned and are gone. He tried to buy the seminary building once. What were you going to do with it, Charlie? He said, sell it to the next person who gave me $1 more. And Charlie was the kind of guy, I say this with all sincerity, that somebody came up to me at church one day and said, would you please get Charlie to take a bath? Charlie was clean physically. It's his clothes that weren't. I mean, when you're handling pigeons in your truck, it's just, anyway, let's leave it at that. And Charlie was a little bit rougher cut guy, and then he talked with the back of his hand, and he had this gravelly kind of voice, and he would just talk with the back of his hand and kind of hit you. And some of us referred to Charlie as the Dean of Men. And we had seminary students that we just took care of Charlie, drove him to church, spent time with him, dearly loved the man. One day he said, hey, some of these Mennonites I know, they're going up to the Bowery Mission in New York. You want to go? Well, that's about as much you'd get out of Charlie. He wasn't going to explain a lot past that. I was like, yeah, Charlie, we'll go. So Joan and I got on the bus with Charlie, and everybody else was speaking Pennsylvania Dutch because they were all talking about us. I'm still convinced of that. It's not that I'm not secure emotionally, but when you go to the football game and they go in that huddle, I think they're talking about me. It's just really bad. So, but when you got all these people speaking Dutch all of a sudden, it's like, Joan, I think they're talking about us. Well, we pull up to the Bowery Mission. And they say, okay, we're going to go inside, and we're going to give you a tour of the mission. And we start to get off the bus, and Charlie takes a step off the bus and gets out of line. He's not going in on the tour. Charlie went into the gutter, sat down next to a guy, started talking to him. Then you're going to come in for the service. They got a free meal. We're going to talk about Jesus. I've never forgotten that. I've never forgotten the intentionality of Charlie getting off that bus. We're there to minister to homeless people. We're to go inside for a tour of the facility and hear about the Bowery mission, but not Charlie. He's on a mission, and he was intentional about it. And see, Jesus knew his purpose on earth, making outsiders insiders, and was always missional, and so must we. We need to always have that kind of missional mindset where we're thinking about the people that we encounter, the people that we might be tempted to step over as we're sending our money to the mission field, when God says, as we'll talk about again some tomorrow, we're in the midst of the largest unreached people group in the world, but are we missional about it, where we're intentional, saying, God, you've put me here? I mean, the blunt thing is, I would ride my motorcycle to Harley-Davidson saying, God, what's up with this? God, why am I in a Harley-Davidson dealership? You know what I wore to the interview? I wore slacks like this, a blue button-down shirt, and a blue blazer, and I looked at the owner and I said, so, what do you wear to an interview at a Harley dealership? And the ridiculous thing is they hired me. And I just had agonizing times. God, why am I here? Why am I here? But then I can tell you about Joan, I can tell you about Bob, and I can tell you about Larry, and I can tell you about others. The opportunity to raise the flag. Tell you about the day I said something just in a conversation. The manager that I was with said, well, I feel I just got taken to church. I said, hey, hang around with me. We'll get you there. But it's that intentionality that Jesus had. And we look at making outsiders insiders, being that evangelism-focused, disciple-making kind of church. We need to be intentional. Now, the second thing is we must be indiscriminate, willing to reach out to anyone. That's kind of the amazing thing here that we sort of miss. We're just, those of us that are of the generation that sang about Zacchaeus up in the tree, we're focused on, he was a short guy, he's in a tree, and Jesus said, I need to come to your house today, and Zacchaeus came down the tree, and away they went. But now that we're adults and we're reading our Bibles, and this is one of my pithy sayings, when you read your Bibles, read your Bibles. Think about your reading. Look at the words there. And have this curiosity mind. There was a man whose name Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. What's that mean? And all of a sudden you realize this was a person who would have been discriminated against. This is a person who would have been disliked. This would be a person who would have been, people would have turned away from him. Like, I can't believe the way you sold out. Look at how you're going. Look at how you're working with the Romans. We could probably work a little bit and come up with some modern day equivalents of where people are involved in something. We look at it and say, I can't believe you're a part of that. That's so disgusting, you're a part of that. And that's the way it would have been for Zacchaeus, and it probably went beyond just saying, Zacchaeus, I can't believe you're part of that. And there's times when we just want to say, hey, forget about you, and walk off. And undoubtedly, and this isn't in the Bible, but you look at the situation, there were probably a lot of people, they looked at Zacchaeus and said, Zacchaeus, you sold out. You sold out your people. You sold out. You went for the money. You didn't care about what's going on. You don't care about what the Romans are doing. And you've just sold yourself out. It's like your friends that vote for the other political party, What's wrong with you? And they looked at me, it's like, what's wrong with you, Zacchaeus? And it's also when you come to those kind of people, it's easy to stay isolated. Yeah. I mean, God gave me a lot of really fun stories. I'm at a funeral. Oh, my. And here's this lady standing there, and my wife's with me, and I look at this lady. I say, how's my favorite bride? And she comes over and gives me a hug. And we walk away, and Joan goes, who's that? You love those moments. I try to avoid them. But I said, oh, her wedding was at the Harley dealership. She goes, what? And I said, yeah. Remember I had to move my desk and everything, and they brought a big band in and all that. And the other day we were walking into Lowe's over in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and I said, now, Joan, if a woman comes up and hugs me, her name is Pam. So how do you know Pam? Pam was one of my coworkers at CarMax. She calls me Tony, Tony. So if somebody comes over and goes, Tony, Tony, give me a hug, that's Pam, okay? So I try to give all these kind of warning signs out there, just like, hey. But, I ended up with these friends that are of such an amazing variety because I chose not to stay isolated. When I was in baseball ministry, I was pastoring a church. It was a conservative kind of church. And every now and then, I would say this from the platform. I'd say, if you ever see me coming out of a bar in downtown Scranton, please ask me why I was there. And I'll tell you what's going to be going on is I meet with ball players one-on-one. And I say to them, where do you want to meet? Now, if they pick out a dive of a bar, I'll say, well, could we go over here instead? But if they say, no, I really like going to this place, I will go to that place. And I risk that some of my friends would look at me and say, what are you doing in a place like that? And I'd say, please, come and ask me. And sometimes we get a little pharisaic and we tend to stay isolated. But in one of the Bibles that has special notes, it says, in every society, certain groups of people are considered outcasts because of their political views, their immoral behavior, or lifestyle. Don't give in to social pressure to avoid them. Just being honest, frank, a little bit open with you, because I've got an airplane ticket, I'm out of here, okay? It really liberates what you can say. But when I moved into the marketplace and I had more gay friends, more LGBTQ friends than I'd ever had, and customers who were LGBTQ, I found myself really thinking through, why do we as Christians have difficulty reaching into that community? And this is not an exaggeration. I probably spent 14 months off and on thinking about that. Walking into work, shaking hands with this one guy and said, it's not an official day till I shake hands with you. And I started that before I knew his lifestyle choice. And I'm not going into the different conclusions I came to, but one is our tendency to isolate ourselves. But not Jesus. Of all people, he picks the chief tax collector and says, I'm going to go with him because he was not only intentional, but he was indiscriminate. And we must be unpredictable, not bound by normalcy. It's one of my common sayings. I've never aspired to normalcy, and say, well, you're not achieving it either, But I mean, how many of you go along talking to a man sitting in a tree? I mean, that's just kind of like strange, isn't it? You're going down the street, some guy's sitting in a tree, and there's all these other people there. Of all the people to talk to, instead of the people that are standing there and greeting them, saying, hey, how you doing, or walking past them, he stops and goes, hey, you up there in the tree. That just doesn't seem like, it just... and we don't need to be bound by programs or acceptable forms. The scariest time I ever shared a devotional was baseball chapel, where the visiting team wanted to sit in the bleachers down the left field line during batting practice for the home team. You know what that's like? Do you understand the words foul ball? And they're sitting in the bleachers. Where am I standing? With my back to the field. And you'd hear the crack of a bat, and you'd watch these guys in front of you, and their eyes would go, home plate, out to outfield, come back to me. Crack of the bat, home plate, out to the outfield, back to me. Home plate. Then they'd do this, and of course I'm like diving under the bench. It was pretty described. Hey, that's where God gave me the place to share the word. Or the day I was wearing shorts and sandals, and ball players, I don't know if you know this, they spit a lot. And we're in the dugout, and this guy leans over, and I'm in the middle of what I'm talking about, and he spits, and I go, hey, I'm wearing sandals, be careful. And I went back to what I'm talking to this poor guy. He's just like, whoa, what happened, But you just, when you get into some of these things, you're not bound by normalcy. And I have friends that when I say I do the blessing of the bikes at a Harley dealership, they go, you do what? The blessing of the bikes. You bless bikes? No, I don't. You can't bless a bike. But here's something in their culture that gives me an opportunity to talk about Jesus, and then I can pray. And I have some pictures of me with a group of bikers standing there talking about Jesus right in front of the Harley-Davidson dealership, because over time, God opened the door that they asked me to be the chaplain of the Hog chapter, the Harley Owners Group. I put chaplain on my motorcycle vest, and I'm kind of like, hey, I just got a free pass to talk about Jesus to anybody around. Well, what are you doing, Tony? Well, I'm the chaplain, remember? Your idea. I've never had to do that with them, though, because you can learn how to be properly unpredictable. As a matter of fact, Sunday school. I mean, how many of you know when Sunday school or what Sunday school was when it first started? Sunday school came about not in 35 AD after the resurrection of Jesus. Sunday school started in the late 1800s and was especially geared for the really down and out outcast children in England. You know, over time it's morphed to a totally different kind of thing, but that was unpredictable, not bound by normalcy either. But there's also a dynamic, and since I'm out of the 60s, I really like this one, is that as you look at this example of Jesus, he's not only intentional, he's going to go after Zacchaeus, he's not only indiscriminate, he's willing to reach out to a chief tax collector, he's not only unpredictable, not bound by normalcy, but we must also be countercultural, reaching out to those who are the least like us. Verse 7. Okay, let me start with 6. So Zacchaeus hurried and came down and received him joyfully, and when they saw it, they all grumbled, "He has gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner." Yeah. Countercultural, reaching out to those least like us. That pastor who talked about the high percentage, 45% being unchurched, he also wrote these words: since people who were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus, did you hear that? People who were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus, people who are nothing like Jesus should like us as well. There should be something about us that causes them to gather at the periphery and stare. See, the people that were least like Jesus, they liked Jesus. We read he was the friend of sinners. We read that he knew prostitutes by their first name. We knew that he would eat with social outcasts. And there was something about the character of Jesus that attracted them. And when we think about the life that we live, and we're dealing with people that are out, social outcasts of some sort or another. I mean, Charlie gets off the bus, everybody else is walking into the Bowery. Charlie gets down in the gutter with the guy and says, "Are you going to come in? You need to hear what we're talking about. And there's got some food in there for you too." I read one time top 10 tips for evangelizing that were written by an atheist. Number 1 was, be like Jesus. Hang with the sinners and judge the judgers. Isn't that interesting? The people least like Jesus, and if we are like Jesus, instead of if you come, you will be welcome, and if you are like us, you will like us. Instead, he reached out to people in the peripheries. The next thing as we go down through here is we must risk our reputation, because mission is more important than reputation. Verse 7, you see it right in there. You know, they're attacking Jesus. You know, he has gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. And people murmured. And sometimes we will end up putting our reputation at risk because we're willing to reach out to anyone. And it doesn't mean our evangelism just on the people that are going to get us talked about, but our evangelism must be so indiscriminate and so intentional that we're willing to reach out to anyone and to seek to build those relationships to help them come to know Jesus. But you also have to keep a watch on yourself, lest you become tempted to become a Christian celebrity. Say, look at me. I hang out with alcoholics. Look at me. I've got a ministry into the great community. Look at me. I'm willing to do this. No, there's got to be this naturalness about it, where what the task is to be the focus. And in all of it, we must be authentic. Verse 5, we must be willing to share in the most natural of settings, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. And it's in those settings that we can show what true integrity is like. It's in those settings that we can show what true humility is like. In those settings, we can show what true forgiveness is like. Forgiveness today, that's a pretty lost quantity. And we can show what true love is like. That thing of humility, I really wrestled with a definition that I liked of humility, and I finally found this one. It's walking without wanting to be noticed. Are you willing to walk without wanting to be noticed? And people sometimes notice you when you are a person of humility, true humility, walking without wanting to be noticed. And another test, I came up with 3 questions to just beat myself up on humility. And so I asked myself, who is beneath me? Is there somebody I look at and I say, you know, they're beneath me? You know what I mean? I'm not like them. The second one is, what is beneath me? Is there something which I say, you know, hey, that's beneath me to do that? I used to bust people at church. I don't know why people thought it was good to just leave paper on the floor at the church. You know, you see a piece of trash on the floor. Why don't you pick it up? You know, make it look a little bit better. Well, we got janitors to pick that up. We don't need to do that. I was at Willow Creek Community Church back in the 80s when I was working on my doctorate, in the late 80s, early 90s. I'm in the men's restroom, and the first time I'd ever seen this guy, he washes his hands, gets the paper towels, dries the paper towels, and he takes that paper towel and he dried off the countertop in the church restroom. That really impressed me. I'd never seen somebody do that. I mean, here's this guy. He's in the bathroom, he washes his hands, takes the paper towels, dries that. That whole scene really ramped up when church started. And he was the worship pastor who did not see drying the sink off in the men's restroom as being beneath him. You know, those are things that we can just kind of look at, and we can ask ourselves the question, you know, so what is it that I think of, or do you have a way that you expect to be treated? You walk in the room, this is how they ought to treat me. But this is what we should be about. This is the kind of person we should be, that we join Jesus in his mission so that we are recognizing he came to seek and to save the lost, and he wants us to join in his mission. Now, I want to really make this real for you. This lesson is kind of like YBH all the way through. It's just yes, all the way through. But I want to drive it home a little bit more. There's times when I'm meeting with the men, and some of you are trying to understand what it is I do in evangelism discipleship. I'm a full-time staff member, area director, Central Pennsylvania for Christian Businessmen's Committee. Coffee, breakfast, more coffee, as you know. But we're Christian Businessmen's Connection, and I meet with about 22 teams over the state, have one-on-one meetings where we talk about evangelism discipleship. And sometimes I will talk to the guys about Acts chapters 3 and 4, where Moses is having this conversation with God, and God says to Moses, this is what I want you to do, and Moses is like, well, I don't really talk that well. Moses, I want you to do this, and Moses just dragging his heels. And finally, in chapter 4, about verse 2, God says to Moses, what is that in your hand? I mean, you talk about a question. What is that in your hand? Now visualize Charleston Heston standing there. Okay. The epitome of Moses. What was in Charleston Heston's hand? I have a stick. They called it a staff. And God said, well, throw it on the ground. And you know the story that goes from there. But I have often challenged people now to just say, what's in your hand? That mentality took me into a baseball locker room. Somebody knew I enjoyed baseball. This baseball player reached out and said, would somebody be willing to have a Bible study for players and their wives? And they said, you ought to call Tony. And one day this baseball player is called, because that's how you get in a locker room on the professional level. Somebody invites you in. And then, I moved to Nebraska, where I got to do chapel once for the Nebraska Cornhuskers. I think some of you have heard of that team. Nebraska Wesleyan, Baylor Vegas baseball team, some things like that. But the next thing that really was in my hand was a golf club. And I had coffee yesterday with a friend of mine I used to play golf with, and we had a group on Friday mornings called TGOF. They golf on Fridays. The first Friday we went, it was Good Friday, and I was new to the area, and we went into the clubhouse, and the only time I ever asked for clergy discount was at the golf course. And here it is, Good Friday, and my friends got the day off, and we go to the golf course. I've never been to that course, and I look at Jeff, the starter, and I say, do you give clergy discount? And he goes, yeah, and you shouldn't be here. Remember, it was Good Friday. It's like, oh, man, that really was. But, you know, we then had this thing where we would barter rate with Jeff, and we just would let guys know, Friday morning, we're the first foursomes off. Sometimes we had 3 foursomes. What was interesting is they all got clergy rate because they were hanging with me, you know, it was really cool. But we had a rule, if it's your first time there, you're in Tony's cart. And I've got about 2.5 hours with a guy in a golf cart. What was in my hand? Golf club. More recently, what was in my hand? It was a Harley throttle. Joan and I went to a biker event with about 34,000 bikers. We looked like 2 Sunday school teachers outside the gates of hell. Because we were. She said, I've never seen many tattoos and blue hair in my life. It was quite the event. The next day at the mission, word kind of got around. Tony was at this biker event. Somebody said, oh, he'll never go to another one of those. And that day I was sitting in training on cross-cultural evangelism. I don't say God spoke to me because people then go, well, was he a bass or a tenor? You know, it's like but God whacked me on the side of the head. Now some want to know right-handed or left-handed. But anyway, and God said to me in his way, bikers are a people group. And I started studying bikers, started researching their culture. And I told the executive team where I was the vice president, this is what I'm doing. And that one Saturday, I got on my bike, throttle in my hand, and drove to a biker meeting in a bar over in Steelton. Pulled into the parking lot. 2 women with cigarettes came over to me and said, how many miles did you drive? I'm like, what? I didn't know what they were talking about. Well, it turns out you get points for miles. You know, okay. Well, I wasn't going to win the contest because I just drove to the bar, that's all, you know. Sorry, that sounds bad, doesn't it? But you understand, you know, I was sober before and after. And so I go in and, you know, man, I don't know what to do. It's a biker meeting in a bar. And I'm walking around like, what do I do? What do I do? You know, I'm not saying that out loud. It's just kind of like, and somebody asks me my name, you know, they're writing stuff down. And it turns out it's their business meeting at the biker meeting. I know afterwards there's a pool tournament, but I broke my pool cue in my last bar fight, you know, so I couldn't do that. And my brother-in-law offered to loan me one. You know, I have a lot of fun with these moments, you know. And I'm sitting there in this biker meeting in a bar, and the guy next to me is trying to get me to vote for him. I finally said, man, this is a lot like church. You know, they're using insider language. They know what all is going on. It's a lot like a church business meeting with 2 differences. There was more swearing and fewer fights. But, you know, it's just kind of like, so this is what it's like to be a visitor at a biker bar meeting, you know? But that took me into the Harley world. That's a CBMC outreach event at Iron Valley Harley Davidson. And the lesson that day was life lessons learned from the seat of a Harley. I had what I called my Amish PowerPoint, big tablet, Joan's handwriting, and I would go over my point, flip the page, as we're going to transition, page 2, you know, page 3, and then I flipped them all back. I gave them a bike riding principle, tied it into life principle, and then I went back through and added a scriptural principle. There was a convicted murderer there who had recently been released from prison who trusted Christ that day. And the day in which we live in is the day in which the nuns are increasing. When it comes to that survey, religious preference, and the bottom one is none, the nuns are increasing. And people are less likely to come to church than ever before, which means we need to go. Survey the ministry of Jesus, and over 90% of it was outside of the synagogue. It's in the marketplace. And when you join Jesus on his mission, you may understand why I will close with this quote from Dr. Seuss. Oh, the places you will go. Okay? Now that's the starting point. Because it's one thing to hear, you will go. It's another thing to change his title and say, oh, the places we will go, we must go. Because now we're getting a little bit more into our context here. But there's this thing that I call the discomfort of the singular. Yeah. You see, when it comes to decision making, the easiest decision you make as a leader is the decision that affects them. The harder decision is the decision that affects us. The hardest decision is the one that affects me. The discomfort of the singular. So now you've got your third version. Oh, the places I must go. Yeah. So where do you go? What are your points of contact? Who are the people you intersect with? And what is that in your hand? You're not all geared to stand up here at the front with a group like this and talk. I'm not geared to stand up here and sing a solo either. You can thank God for that. But it's not a matter of us just knowing, it's a matter of doing. Because God didn't give us these lessons just to increase our knowledge, but to affect the way that we live, where we will take the mission of Jesus and join him in it to make outsiders insiders. So we're going to get to take a break. You get to load up on more wheat and caffeine. And then we're going to approach another subject, some of the realities of outreach, go into a passage in the book of Acts. And so let's just pray. God, we're going to break and we're going to enjoy the donuts and the coffee and the chatter and the candy on the table and checking our emails and our Facebook posts and all those electronic things that tie us to our devices. But don't let us forget that we really need to think about, oh, the places I must go to join Jesus in his mission. And it's in his name we pray. Amen.